session from the Minister. Our fourth speaker today is Guy Salmon from the CEO of Ecological Foundation. Guy's resume is just as impressive as Mike's and contains a lot of words bigger than wheelbarrow. He wears many hats, including that of the third-generation conservationist, instrumental in the abolition of Forest Service and creation of the Department of Conservation in 1987. Guy will give us a perspective from the top down as to what we can expect in the future with regards to government and community expectations on environmental issues which we are facing now and in the future. I'd like you to welcome Guy Salmon.
Gosh, thank you, Tony, and good afternoon, everyone. Fantastic to be here. It's a fantastic learning environment for me. I've had so many great conversations since I arrived this morning, and I'm learning a lot more from you than you're going to learn from me, I fear. Having said that, I got a bit of a briefing from deer industry people, and particularly Tony Pearce, who told me a lot about the history of the deer industry, which, you know, is an impressive story. We have Sir Tim Wallace here. And I do remember well Peter Elworthy, a lot of people who were bold and visionary and entrepreneurial and got the whole thing starting and got it through as it went through bumpy phases, got it propelled forward. A second thing about the industry which is important is that it's been providing leadership on getting into premium markets, and there's a renewed enthusiasm for Savannah, and the story we just heard earlier about Velvet, you know, is from the same playbook. And the third thing, which is really important, is the very early attention which the industry paid to environmental issues, going back to the Land Care Manual in 2004, and today you're launching an environmental code of practice. So there's three things there about the industry which New Zealand, I think, really likes. The entrepreneurialism, the effort to get primary produce into premium markets, and the environmental leadership. We, you know, in a way, my message is do more of these things because this is the way forward, and it's going to be a really positive story if we can get it right. However, there are some big public issues coming out. And, you know, I speak to you not as an expert in deer farming, of course. I'm going to focus for that reason on the strategic issues. I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly how to face these issues, but I wanted you to realise how big and important they are for the period coming ahead. You're looking at a picture of Lake Brunner, which for 17 years was in decline. There's a woman in that catchment called Katie Milne who has a dairy farm. She also happens nowadays to be the president of Federated Farmers. She got a group of farmers together and they turned the whole thing around, and the lake is now improving. So this is a fantastic story, I think, and a starting point which points directions in which we could move with catchment collectives, people working together and doing the right thing by nature, the environment, and the expectations of both New Zealanders and our overseas consumers. But we still have a very strong sense, and it was so apparent at the last election campaign, that there's a lack of accountability toward community expectations about fresh water. And there's an anger and frustration which, you know, I think helped to sweep from office my old friend, the Environment Minister, Nick Smith, who I thought was doing quite a good job at trying to get on top of that, but he wasn't doing it fast enough, and part of the reason he wasn't doing it fast enough because he had kind of a long tail of people in the cabinet who weren't moving as fast as they should. And that is pretty much the situation in the primary sector in New Zealand. There's this long tail which has got to be you know, faced with realities and either moved forward or invited to exit from the industry. And the climate change issue is going to particularly bring that into sharp focus because it's not well understood. How many people here have worked out how it's going to affect your farm finances if you go into the emissions trading scheme on the basis outlined in the coalition agreement? Hands up somebody who can tell me the numbers. I mean, I'm blinded by the lights here, but I can't see anybody. So this is an underestimated issue, and it's coming on really, really fast. As the Prime Minister famously said, you know, Climate change is the nuclear-free moment for our generation, and we are going to fix this. And that is happening. It's happening really fast. The industry's taken I think, really important step forward with this new Environmental Management Code of Practice, which is detailed, is good, and is going to drive a lot of learning and change within the industry. But I just wanted to say that any environmental code of practice nonetheless has some limitations, and three in particular I wanted to talk about. One is the difficulty of getting everybody to do it. And let me say a bit more about that, and this is really focused on people who are thinking about a premium product. There's this old diagram, which of course you've seen many times, about how technology diffuses and about how new practices move. On the left-hand side, you have the innovators and the early adopters who are providing the right sort of leadership and are proving that something can be done. Then you have this kind of chasm where you're trying to get the rest of the industry to follow you. But once you get across that chasm, you have a great big hump of people who will follow and will do the right thing. But what I'm really focused on as an environmentalist is the people on the right-hand side of that diagram, who the technology diffusion people call the laggards. But what worries me about them is that they may do nothing at all. They won't just be laggards. They will undermine the reputation of your industry, undermine your social license, and undermine the brand that you're trying to build in overseas markets. And the real challenge that anybody in the primary sector who's trying to provide some environmental or brand leadership has got to face up to is, how do we deal with those people? So there's one way of approaching this has been, developing environmental codes of practice, but there's a gap, and it's obvious in this one as well, between what's in the code of practice and what are the community expectations which are being expressed through the Resource Management Act. So we have that document which came out before the election, setting out the government's plans for the new National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management, or the revised version of it. That led to decisions in August that every catchment in New Zealand is going to have limits set for all the main contaminants, and many parts of the country are going through processes right now of setting those limits. But there's a lot of people who think that just by going with the Environmental Code of Practice, which is more lenient, has a lot of where possibles scattered through it and so forth, is going to actually be okay. But actually, the Environmental Code of Practice really needs to be seen as a way of getting to the limits which the community is setting, because the community wants to do the swimming and the fishing and the gathering of mahinga kai and all of the things that we used to be able to take for granted in New Zealand and have disappeared in the last 20 years. And so there's a really important linkage which has to be built between the code of practice and those limits. And the accountability has to be there, and that's where we get into two kinds of difficulty. The first is just a political one, that a lot of people don't want to be accountable to those limits. But there's also a technical problem, which is, even if you were as well motivated as you ought to be about meeting community limits, it's very hard for us to measure your performance at a property level because the cost of measuring is too great. And there's only two ways around this problem. One is to use models like Overseer and Lucy, and there's an awful lot of work to be done on those two models before they're going to be fit for purpose for holding individual farmers accountable for their nutrient discharges to the environment. Or alternatively, farmers could get themselves organised in catchment collectives, just as Katie Milne organised with the Lake Brunner farming community, to be collectively accountable, so that where the stream that flows out of your catchment meets the main river, there's a monitoring point there, and you're kind of collectively accountable for getting the right numbers at that monitoring point. And I actually think that catchment group approach is something which every group of primary sector players really needs to take a close look at, because it's got huge potential for preserving the best things around the New Zealand story, which is on the one hand meeting high environmental standards, but on the other hand leaving to farmers the flexibility about how to do those standards, how to meet them. And that's a learning process, and it often produces best results if it's done in a group. So, whoops, am I just running faster than I should be? No, I've got another slide in here that I'd forgotten about. This is my third concern about codes of practice. That actually there are some issues out there which are suddenly coming into the public spotlight, and a code of practice, as your one does in the case of intensive winter grazing on fodder crops, for instance, it says all the right sort of things, that you shouldn't be putting these close to waterways, and you shouldn't be putting them on soil types which are prone to pugging. But there's always the word "if possible" in there. And we sort of got to a point with some of these things where, if it isn't possible, we have to find a way of making it possible. And this is where we have to go beyond the code of practice mentality and think, okay, this has got to be transformational change, and we have really got to take ownership of this problem as an industry. So when I look at photographs like that one I took the other day of, winter feeding, I mean, it's not on a deer farm, it's on a dairy farm, and most of the problem is in this space are not deer issues, but you're going to get caught up in this as the sheep and beef industry and the deer industry are moving more and more into fodder beet, and we're getting more and more mud, and we're getting more and more sediment flowing off, and we're getting animal welfare issues where animals that really need to lie down and rest and ruminate being forced to stand in mud for long periods of time. And there are pictures like this out there. We know the climate change story, the most dangerous gas from agriculture is nitrous oxide. It's generated disproportionately from urine falling on cold, muddy soils during the winter. This is an issue which is, is a time bomb for you guys as you try and build your brand and your market credibility both internationally and with the New Zealand public. So it's an area where something needs to be done faster. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to say. And unfortunately, as I said, I'm not a deer farming expert, and I don't know exactly how you're going to tackle this. I know enough about it to know there's a lot of different options, and there's a lot of complexity in it. All I'm saying to you is find a way forward on this issue. So let me come back to those catchment groups I was just introducing a moment ago. I think this is a really important idea which could make things happen faster in terms of environmental management in New Zealand. The idea essentially is that you get together with other farmers in your catchment, not exclusively people in your own sector, but people in other sectors, including perhaps forest owners, who are all contributing to the state of that waterway, and you talk about and you learn how to fix those issues. And you also talk about the other issues in the catchment, which might be around soil conservation, the need to get the streams vegetated so that there's not sediment getting trampled into them, the question of how the climate change issues are going to be tackled and how the nitrous oxide can be reduced. If there are some biodiversity issues, there's a national policy statement coming up on preserving biodiversity, which is going to have implications for most catchments, and you're going to have to think about and discuss how you're going to do that. And if you do this kind of collectively, you're helping to get the long tail people engaged and getting them to try some new tricks. And you're also got a facility there in which you can share the cost of what needs to be done, whether it's professional advice about how to manage these issues, or whether it's getting some catchment works in place, like, often rather than try and reduce nitrogen fertiliser on your farm, it might be cheaper to share the cost of a constructed wetland at the bottom of the catchment, which can pick up all that nitrogen and stop it getting into the main waterway. Or if you're in a spring-fed stream in Canterbury and that stream has become degraded over the last 20 years with a thick layer of sediment on the bottom over the stony bottom of the stream, which is effectively killing the ecological health of that stream for years to come because it's a spring-fed stream and it can't flush itself out, then you guys have really got to get together and dig the sediment out and, stop it getting back in again. And these are things that often can be better achieved in a collective than they can by simply trying to impose a liability on an individual farm. And this is all about measuring your results. You can stand at the bottom of the stream and take some water samples and show the world, put it up on your website, show the world that you are doing a great job of looking after the environment. And it wouldn't be too difficult for you to put some comparative things up about how you're beating the Irish or the Australians or all the other people that you're competing in the marketplace with. Let me come to my last topic, which is around the climate. We signed the Framework Convention on Climate Change, New Zealand, at Rio de Janeiro in 1992. That's 26 years ago. And since then, we've done almost nothing to address our obligations under that agreement. And that 26 years of delay and prevarication is now coming to an end because of the change of government. Unfortunately, I mean, we've had all through that time quite a solid piece of research effort to find out how to reduce methane emissions from the rumen of cows and other ruminant animals, including deer. And there hasn't been any silver bullet come out of that. We may still get one, but there's nothing in sight for the next few years. And so the world is now really starting to move away from reliance on meat produced by ruminant animals toward monogastric animals, and this has been going on for a while, pork meat and poultry, and to plant proteins, and now to cell-grown proteins. And these are going to be a big competitive threat, of course. And if New Zealand meat producers are going to stay in business, they're actually going to need, and they can't somehow reduce these emissions, then they're actually going to need to pay to offset them through the emissions trading scheme. And that's really why the emissions trading scheme is coming more and more into focus now. If we can't find on-farm research-based solutions, then the next step is to pay for an offset. So this is, in a sense, a cost of doing business issue, not just a technology issue. And it comes right back to where we started, I guess, which is to say that in many ways, one of the most helpful things that you can do for the environment is earn more for your product, increase the value of your product so that you can afford to pay for these environmental mitigations, which are big and they're going to become more expensive. Just looking a bit more closely at those, the coalition agreement says that, and this only lasts for the next 3 years, that you won't be exposed to more than 5% of the total cost involved in emissions under the emissions trading scheme. Bear in mind that the other 95% is a direct subsidy from other New Zealanders, and that's going to become more and more a salient talking point with the public, who thinks, that we phased out agricultural subsidies 40 years ago, or 30 years ago. But, it will be an issue, and it's going to be important for you to gradually take up more of the load of New Zealand's responsibilities as soon as you can. But even at that 5%, what's going to happen is that a marginal price will emerge, which will mean that if you increase your emissions by 5%, perhaps by increasing your stock numbers, you will pay quite a lot for that. On the other hand, if you reduce your emissions by 5%, perhaps by getting on top of your winter feeding issues, you will get quite a substantial reward for doing that. So I think this is quite an important step for New Zealand livestock farmers. They're finally going to get a reward for doing the right thing. And the reward will get bigger as we can gradually move this past the 5% into a larger percentage. A second point I'd make about it, though, is that so far the ETS has really relied on people who've emitted a whole lot in transport or whatever field of activity, cement production, oil refining. What they do is they pay for a forest to be planted, a commercial forest to be planted, which offsets their emissions. And the trouble with it is that it doesn't actually offsets those emissions. All it really does is defers the emissions liability for 28 years until the trees are cut down. So we're shifting the burden from the baby boomer generation who put them all out during the 1990s, and they took advantage of the tree planting spike in 1993, and we've been coasting along without really having any real cost as a country. And now, as we come into the 2020s decade, we're going to face all these trees that were planted back then getting cut down and a huge spike in our national emissions liability. We can't keep on doing this. We actually have to say that in future the ETS is going to be run on the basis that for long-lived gases, you're going to have to plant a permanent forest, which doesn't just defer the emissions liability for 28 years. And if you don't do that, all you're doing is loading the taxpayer, future taxpayers with liabilities, and we already have a lot of that kind of thing going on and being resented by younger New Zealanders. As well as that, it's almost inevitable, I believe, and most economists also believe this, that emissions credits will become internationally tradable over the next few years. It won't happen immediately because the whole business of international trade and credits became so discredited just recently, but it will resume. And the reason it will resume is that the cost of reducing emissions varies so much from one country to another that we really can't afford not to trade in them. It's a bit like motor vehicles or cell phones, you know. And so once we start trading, land prices in New Zealand will go up in hill country to reflect the value of what overseas purchasers are willing to pay for credits. That will mean that people who are still emitting are going to have to pay a lot more for their emissions as well. And that means livestock farmers. So just looking forward a bit, there's some quite big things coming up there which need you, I think, really invite you to think about what are your business risks going forward and how you're going to manage them in this environment. Now, I come to some slightly better news. There are two agricultural greenhouse gases, and they're quite different from each other. Methane, these are a couple of sheep which are having their methane measured. Deer also put out methane, but much less than other ruminant animals, and that's the first part of the good news for people in the deer industry. You will be paying less than your compatriots in the sheep and beef sectors. But there's a more important reason why you don't need to worry as much about methane, and that is that it's actually a short-lived gas and is different in that respect from carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. So it's a kind of gas for which it is perfectly legitimate to plant a pine forest and cut it down in 28 years, because at the end of that 28 years, almost all of the methane that you put into the atmosphere will have disappeared again. So although methane in the short term is a very powerful greenhouse gas, you can plant a forest and you can address it in that way and in a way which is perfectly environmentally honest and acceptable. The tough, dangerous greenhouse gas from agriculture is nitrous oxide. And it's much more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas forcing agent in the atmosphere. And it's like carbon dioxide in that it accumulates consistently. It has very long lifetimes running into centuries. Planting a forest just won't cut it as a way of addressing that issue. And it's hard to reduce. But there are, unlike methane, there are things that we know we can do to make a difference. And they come down to an issue which you're going to have to face up to anyway, which is how do you close the nitrogen cycle? Everybody in livestock farming is importing quite a lot of nitrogen, either in fertiliser or in feed or in PKE, you know. And that nitrogen is not a closed loop. It's finding its way into groundwater and into the atmosphere. And there are a lot of things that can be done to close that loop, partly improving the efficiency of the farm system and the livestock themselves through better breeding. A big step which could make a huge difference is looking much more closely at using biological organic farming systems which rely on very minimal amounts or zero amounts in the case of organics on nitrogen fertiliser applications, and much more on the use of legumes to provide the nitrogen that's required by the livestock. We are really handicapped in New Zealand because we don't have any reliable, robust studies of the financial performance of these types of farming systems. And we do need that. There's quite a bit of evidence when you talk to people who do this kind of farming that it requires more intensive monitoring, and you have a larger labour cost component in your farm budget because of the extra work that has to be done and the extra skill that's required to manage these kinds of farms successfully. So understanding the financial performance of this is quite a complex issue, but it's something which needs to be, investment needs to be made in doing that modelling work. Then there are changes to feeding systems that can be made which can enable you to avoid overloading urine onto those cold, muddy soils. And that may mean, some concrete, although we have studies which suggest that people who put in concrete pads are actually paying for them by increasing their stocking rate, and so there's no net benefit for the environment. There's going to be a whole lot of different ways of dealing with this problem which are going to vary depending on the system, the circumstances and system that you're farming with. But my plea is, please address it because it's coming down the tunnel at you. And the last point I'd make on this slide is simply that, any nitrous oxide that you can't mitigate on your farm is going to become really expensive for you to buy an offset for. And so you just don't want to have that cost on your farm business if you can avoid it. So I guess, if I can just try and draw some conclusion out of what I've just said, I guess I'm kind of coming back to that address we had this morning from Lane Jager. He said the industry has got these two pathways ahead. One of them was to continue down pretty much as you are, and the other was to adopt a much more transformational vision. And Lane was quite careful to say that you could just continue on the path as you are, which he thought, wasn't a non-viable way forward. I guess I differ from Lane on that issue. And I'd point out that Lane wasn't really building into his strategic analysis the implications of the emissions trading scheme and the rising appetite for looking after fresh water and the environment generally. I think that if you do factor in those things, then as an industry, you're inevitably going to be driven into his pathway number 2, which is a pathway which aims to get much greater value for your products and which will enable you to do the right thing environmentally to underpin your social licence and to underpin your international brand position. So I'm a pretty keen supporter for all the primary sectors of going down that track so that you can get on top of these environmental issues and so New Zealand can continue to feel a kind of glow of benefit from all the ways in which you and the deer industry have provided leadership to us over the years. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Guy. I think that certainly provokes a whole new train of thought through us, right through from community responsibilities right through to ETS. So it's something that I'm sure will be very much the focus going forward. Is Mike still here too? We've sort of got now time for some questions and answers. Let's see. Oh, yeah. So if you want to come up to the stage and we can sort of open it up for some more thought-provoking questions to test these two a bit further.
Yeah, Guy. Just a question here. You asked anybody in the audience if they knew how much it cost us, the ETS program. Can you tell us how much it's going to cost us?
Well, I started writing a slide which was going to tell you this information, and I thought I didn't want to end on a negative note. And I also, actually, another compelling reason is that it is so variable depending on the practices on your farm. Not so much for methane, because you can't change that very much, but there's a lot of ways a deer farmer can change the management of his or her property, which can reduce your nitrous oxide costs. So there's quite a lot of uncertainties in giving you any numbers. I think it's better that you talk with farm advisors about how to manage these costs. You may not be able to do much about the methane, but you certainly can do a lot of things about the nitrous oxide. And if you bear in mind that the nitrous oxide, once the emissions trading scheme is brought into being a net zero concept in line with what the Prime Minister is saying, rather than a defer it to the next generation concept, then nitrous oxide is going to get more expensive to offset. And so you need to factor that in. So there's a lot of moving parts in the calculation, and I think it would be a bit premature for me to just give you numbers because they would, A, be rather depressing at this stage, and B, wouldn't necessarily be accurate.
Yeah, hi Guy. Just the question on the, I was just a bit concerned when you were sort of referring that Western New Zealand is subsidising us, comparing it to subsidies earlier on. Like in my view, it's no relevance to the SMPs that we had back in the 70s and 80s. And I guess as farmers, we're not entirely happy about how it was thought out when the deal was signed up all those years ago and the implications it would have on us. And the rest of New Zealand isn't subsidising farmers, and a lot of farmers are not sure how fair the deal really is on them. And the rest of New Zealand has, the agriculture is a big part of our economy, and so to say that they're subsidising us, I think, is totally unfair.
Yeah, well, I can relate to what you're saying, and certainly, I was aware back in the SMP days and the days of the land development encouragement loans and all those other Muldoon bag of tricks that a lot of farmers weren't that happy with what was happening. But I still would stick with the analogy because, Kiwis who drive cars and use steel and aluminium and cement are paying significant amounts for their emissions. And they not only have to pay for the 50% of emissions that they are causing themselves, but they're also paying for the 50% of New Zealand's emissions which livestock farmers are producing. And so it's going to become, I think it's going to become an issue of public debate and contention that this is a subsidy. So all I'm saying, whether I call it a subsidy or not is beside the point. My point to you is some people are going to call it a subsidy, and you're going to have to think about, what's your response to that? Simply denying it won't do the trick, I don't think.
You've spoken with the David Ackland over here. Sorry, you've spoken about the three separate gases. Do you see them being separated out in time and traded on separate platforms with regards to lifetimes of nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide?
Not exactly. There's a very excellent little environmental group called Generation Zero, which I sort of really like because they're quite reasonable people. They're young people, they're upset that all these costs are getting shifted onto them by the older generation and by the farming community and by people who are allowing cities to sprawl and so on, but they've taken a very kind of dialogue-oriented approach. Mm-hmm. And they've come up with this idea of a basket of gases, ETS, and essentially there would be two baskets in the ETS. One would be a basket which just has methane in it, and this is a short-lived gas. You can plant a radiata pine forest to offset it at reasonably low cost, and you can get a return on the investment of the pine forest. And so the price in the ETS for that basket is going to be quite low, and I don't think you need to get hugely worried about it. The second basket is going to have two gases in it, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. And those are going to be expensive to offset because they need permanent offsets. In the short run, that's going to come about by planting trees or reverting land to get into permanent native forest. In the longer run, those permanent offsets are going to come about by people pumping carbon dioxide underground and storing it in abandoned oil fields and gas fields and so on. And that's an expensive business. And ultimately, you're going to have to pay the cost of that kind of offset. So what I think will happen if Generation Zero persuade the new government to go down this track is that, for farmers' point of view, methane will become quite a small issue, and the big challenge will be nitrous oxide because that will be very expensive to offset, and you've really got to find a way of stopping it getting into the atmosphere in the first place. And the same burden, exactly the same burden, will be on people who put out carbon dioxide, which of course is urban people.
Just a couple of quick points. Firstly, often this gets into the conversation piece here, Guy, in New Zealand. We need to remember that New Zealand farmers, like every other New Zealander, are currently paying for their emissions and energy and electricity as well. So, New Zealand farmers are contributing to some of the gases that we put out. But look, the second point, I'd strongly recommend, if you want to get your head around the short-lived, long-lived gases, the Productivity Commission report that was released a couple of weeks ago by Murray Shewan has a very, very good piece on gases, short-lived gases, long-lived gases, what they really mean, and the proportion of them and some options to mitigate. So look, I'd seriously recommend, this is going to be a massive debate and discussion that we're going to have as a country, and it's a really, really good piece of work, and it's good reading.
And I should just add that it's 508 pages.
Just go to the piece on the gas, that's all you need.
Yeah, look, Guy, just congratulations on your catchment-based approach. I couldn't agree more that there should be a catchment-based approach, and we hope we can get the regional councils to take it on board. But I do have a few minor issues, and one, everybody that delivers from your side of the, I don't think there should be sides, but everybody that's supposedly ecologically minded delivers us a photo of mud and on a farm, and I don't see, and I just ask you to remember at all times that urban dwellers, they spit oil on the road, they burn rubber, and they do crap, and go down to Milford Beach or somewhere like that after the storm and see what it is, and I don't see you guys putting up any photos of there, because that is a problem, and we're doing a bit. Now look, and the other one that I'd like to talk to you about is unintended consequences. And I think I first come across you in the early 80s when you were in the Native Forest Action Council. And you talked about planting permanent forests. And I think of a little town called Minganui where they were planting permanent forests. And you managed to get the Forest Service destroyed, and DOC took over, and they've made a complete cock-up of the whole thing. The forest stopped getting thing. And the other thing that I would ask is, before you get too carried away with anything, is go back to a town like Minganui and have a look at the social and economic carnage that you caused there. And it's not that we can't improve our rivers, but just have a wee think about what you cause and what can carry on, and the methods that you use to achieve what you achieve.
Well, I'm very happy to take that on the chin. Certainly the outcome at Minganui wasn't what we were pushing for, which, as you'll remember, was to convert the Minganui sawmill to handle exotics from the Kaingaroa forest, which is 12 miles away from the mill. And Richard Prebble at the time took the decision to close it down and allocate the wood to a mill in Rotorua. And so the social consequences for Minganui were severe. I learned a lot from that, and when I, 7 years later, became the negotiator for the environment movement on the West Coast Forest Accord, we did a deal there for which I got roundly criticised by environmentalists, which gave the sawmilling industry 15 years to phase across to exotics, so that we didn't have any more Minganuis and we didn't have any on the West Coast. And really that's what I stand for now when I look at the rural situation. Mike Joy gives me a hard time on Facebook, those of you who see these debates. He gives me a hard time for not caning the farmers. And I keep saying, farmers are going to need, for this scale of change, they're going to need 10 or 15 years to make the change. And we need to make sure they are going to make the change, but when they are committed to it, we've got to give them the time. And so, I have learned something from Minganui. And New Zealand's got to learn from it.
Please.
Graham Sutton, Guy, like Guy and Mike to both comment on this one, and I take your point and hear what you're saying about urban people thinking that they're giving a subsidy to farmers. That's nothing new. We've lived with that all our lives, I think. But what I think we need to understand is, and lift the conversation a little bit higher, and that we're only, as I understand it, we're the only country in the world that are going to have emissions on animals, and that clearly is going to be and that's where Mike liked the comment, that's going to give us a distinct disadvantage with our competitors around the world. And I just wonder whether we didn't ought to be lifting the debate outside of New Zealand back to where the negotiations were done, or whether animals should be in it anyway. Nobody else is doing it. Why were we silly enough to agree to that? So I'd like comments from both.
I'd make 2 points in response, Graham. Firstly, that it's certainly difficult for us if we're in a commodity business, because we have to get the cheapest product out there, and it's not going to be cheapest if we're bearing these emissions liability for us to compete with commodities which are. But actually our game plan is to get out of commodities, And so we ought to be able to design a phased process of bringing farmers into the ETS, which supports the New Zealand story about being clean and green and naturally pure and all the rest of it, you know? And we can only do that if we are genuine and we've got an authentic back room there. And the second thing I'd say is that environmental groups all around the world are putting pressure on governments to bring their farming communities into their emissions trading schemes or carbon taxes or whatever they have in those countries. And that's particularly the case in Europe. It's a really, really big thing. And when you look at who's competing with New Zealand in these more premium type markets and things like infant formula and so on, you know, it's these big European companies like Danone and Unilever and Arla Foods, you know, they are going to be facing these same kind of costs that New Zealand farmers will face as they come into the emissions trading scheme. So this is not about using that old excuse that we should do nothing and wait for somebody else to move first. This is actually about designing a sensible transition plan in which we move forward progressively and we get ourselves into a place where we can charge a premium. And if we can charge that premium, then we can cover the cost. It's chicken and egg, I know, but I think it's not beyond us to devise something that will work.
Yeah, a couple of points from me too, Graham. Look, I get a bit tired of people talking about New Zealand being commodities, because actually the amount of value that is being created that doesn't actually get talked about is insanely impressive. So whether it's in the deer industry or other sectors, actually the move from commodities to value happened a long time ago, and it's continuing to happen. So I think that's the first point. But look, but the second point and more important point for me is that we have been having some conversations with Minister James Shaw about the two aspects that he's promoting at the moment. Firstly, the Zero Carbon Act, or the ambition for New Zealand to be zero net carbon by 2050. And secondly, the inclusion of agriculture in the ETS. And look, my strong advice and a number of others have been that we should not focus on the latter, we should focus on the former. Because in my view, the minute you start talking about the ETS and agriculture in the ETS, everyone looks at what the cost is going to be. For me, I would much rather we'd put that to one side for now, because the reality is if we achieved zero net emissions for our sector, the cost would be zero. You understand? So for me, I'd much rather focus on the zero net emissions by 2050, and let's actually work at how we can get there rather than focus on the ETS. And my concern is that these two pieces of work that are running in parallel at the moment, I think that the discussion and debate around the ETS and the inevitable dollar numbers that will come out, and you'll see them, headlines will be $40,000 a farm, that's what it'll be, something like that. And that will derail the discussion we should be having, which is where we can create a point of difference and an opportunity for our farmers, which is zero net carbon by 2050.
Yeah, Guy, a similar question, but I'd like to talk about the politics of being green. And following on from the Graham who just spoke, and firstly, I think we're all in this together, and that's what's not happening at the moment. It's a large group of people blaming a small group of people. We've got a population increase of 800,000 since the thing was signed, and we're trying to meet a level at that stage. A thing I'd like you to do is, really following on from Graham's comment, is when you're talking to an urban group, just say, no one else in the world, the farmers in ETS, would like to bring them in because we all want to be environmentally green. So you have a different conversation rather than saying the bad bastards out there, it's all their fault. The second thing is, just recently, I'm not talking about beaches in Auckland, just out of curiosity, on the same issue, I just called up Auckland Council's water report. The latest one I get is 2015. And I was flabbergasted that particularly Waitakere's, as you'd expect, is fine. We hear about when a beach closes because that's just a stormwater thing. But streams around Papakura, Otaki's Creek, Otara Stream, I was gutted. Some of them had E. coli levels of 1.3 million and medium levels in the thousands. And we're trying to achieve 100, 120 maybe, that swimmable level, maybe 170. So what I'd like to see is honesty, integrity about the discussion. And just one other example that I'd like you to do is I heard a lady the other day talking about electric cars, and the first thing she said was, she's from Vector, I think, or Mercury, saying, it comes from geothermal. Let's be honest, 50% comes from hydro, which they hate, 16% comes from gas. So, if we're going to move forward, it's got to be an overall societal discussion with some integrity and honesty and not just politics.
Yeah, I think you make some fair points. There's two basic issues there, aren't they? One of them is, the first point you're making is really about us all being in this together and collaborating. I've been rather keen on that, and as many in the room will know, I managed to persuade the previous minister to set up the Land and Water Forum. I've participated in it for 9 years. I think it's a fantastic model for reaching agreement about doing things in a gradual and sensible way, for moderating some of the shriller voices on both sides, all these kind of benefits. And it's really in the balance at the moment as to whether it's going to survive. David Parker kind of grudgingly said, well, since the money's already been allocated, you can carry on to the end of the financial year, but I want you to solve a few problems. And we're trying to reach agreement on that at the moment, which is hard. But what happens after, the financial year ends? Are we still going to be collaborating, or are we going to be going back to a whole series of Greenpeace campaigns with big photos of mud, which is what I was trying to warn you about, really. So I really think that we've become a more sectarian society in recent years. The urban people and the rural people have got into different tribes. When I meet with Greenpeace people, as I do regularly in the National Leadership Forum on Environmental NGOs, a lot of them don't really talk to farmers. They don't understand how difficult it is to do some of these things. They're not willing to give anybody any time to do them. So we've got to somehow keep collaboration going, and that means that people like Damien O'Connor and particularly David Parker and Jacinda Ardern need to hear that farmers value it. Because if they don't hear that all they'll hear is Mike Joy, So that's I think, is important in response to the first part of your question. The second part is around integrity. And whenever I look at these claims that I think that can't be right, and I take them up with somebody rather, I often find that they just didn't really understand things properly. And if I can do a little story which is self-critical about the environment movement, do you remember during the election campaign there was a terrific media hype about how Nick Smith's swimmability standard was really lowering the standard, shifting the goalposts, and was a complete con. When I was a bit bewildered by that at first, because on the face of it, it looked plausible, and there was a scientist coming on Radio New Zealand saying this is true, Nick is conning everybody. But when I looked at it, I discovered that the only part of the river flow that was meeting a lower standard was 5% of the time during flood peaks, which were almost all in winter, when nobody was wanting to swim anyway. The other 95% of the time, the river was going to be much better under Nick Smith's standard. And there is a good reason for not having such a high standard during floods, because how the hell would you actually get all those livestock off the paddocks near the waterways and stop stuff getting into a flooded stream? It's really unreasonable. And not only that, you'd have to double the size of all the sewage treatment plants in small towns which can't afford them anyway. And so it seemed to me to be a really well-balanced and sensible policy. But, and most New Zealanders, when I explain this to them, they agree that it's sensible policy, but most of my environmental colleagues said it was a con, and they got a lot of media coverage for that. And when I asked them about it, what it came down to wasn't that they were lacking integrity, it wasn't that they were wanting to tell lies, it's just that they didn't understand the policy that had been announced. And one of the great things about a thing like the Land and Water Forum is that if you're in it, you get to grips with all these complexities and you understand things properly. And that's one of the strongest reasons why we want it to continue. But as I say, a lot of these things are going to become a lot more difficult, both on the collaboration and trust front and on the integrity of public statements front, if we can't continue these sort of institutional arrangements which are collective in nature, like the Land and Water Forum or catchment collectives, which can help us operate as a country that's sort of all in the same boat together and is cooperating together. That's the vision I have.
One last question, as long as quick one.
Yeah, Martin Ruber here. One more question for Guy. He's got to suffer, I think. Question is why methane, agricultural methane, has to be in the ETS. It's a short-lived gas. Every molecule that an ruminant emits goes up in the sky, and in about 12 and a half years, on average, it gets broken down into CO2, carbon dioxide. The plant takes up the carbon dioxide, and the cow eats it, or the deer eats it, the ruminant eats it, and it's a closed loop. It just goes around and around. There's no burden on the atmosphere as such. Actually, methane gases in the atmosphere are declining. So why should we get taxed for agricultural methane emissions?
Well, what you've just said is actually at variance with the scientists who've really specialised in this study. And I'd urge you to Google up a presentation which Andy Reisinger of the New Zealand, what's it called, the Pastoral Greenhouse Gases Research Coalition or Research something or other. And he's got a very nice presentation which he made to a seminar organised by Motu about last November, December, in which he kind of shows the problem with methane. So what you're saying is kind of right up until the point at which our other long-lived greenhouse gases start to peak and decline. So up until then, methane emissions don't really matter because they don't have any effect on the behaviour of the climate system. As the other long-lived emissions start declining, methane becomes more and more important as a driver of global change. And when you get the other gases down to net zero, if you still have quite a lot of methane there, which is not being offset by trees, then the climate will continue to warm, and you'll continue to go down the spiral of losing control of the climate, which is what we're really worried about here. So it's quite a complex story to explain, but methane isn't as big a problem as has sometimes been presented, that is true, but on the other hand, as Andy shows very clearly with these graphs and things, we do have to ultimately bring it under control, and we may not have to get methane emissions to zero, but those emissions that we do have will have to be offset by a forest. So that, without getting into too much more technical complexity, is the essence of the issue. You're sort of right at the moment, but you won't be right in 10 years' time, is what I'm saying, I guess.
Yeah, it kind of depends on what scientist you listen to, actually.
This is very technical now. This is very confusing for a farmer from Waipukurua. I just wanted to make a couple of quick comments because, and this may be surprising to you, but you know, there's been a lot of interaction with this government, and particularly with Ministers James Shaw, David Parker, Damien O'Connor, and the Prime Minister. I just want to leave you on a positive note because there is a real willingness by the Prime Minister in particular not to go to war with the sector. A really, really strong willingness. She is resolute. It's not the way she wants to do things. And I know there's been a lot of talk from Minister Parker in recent times about, you know, what he thinks about farming. But he's talking about nutrients. But these guys are genuine in their desire to work with the sector as long as the sector's prepared to share in the bigger vision, the bigger goal. You know, so I'd strongly encourage you to think about the bigger vision, the bigger goal. If we're prepared to work towards these, what some might call bold ambitions for New Zealand, then they're prepared to give plenty of time for transition. They're prepared to help fund the technologies and tools that we'll need to get to those objectives and goals, and they're prepared to work with the sector. I really don't think they want to go to war, and I know they don't want to regulate. They would like the sector to pick this up themselves. So I'd encourage you to work with them and not against them.